Now. Okay. Hello, everyone. Welcome back to the channel. This will be my first post after a bit of a hiatus. So I'm coming back. I'm going to be posting more often in a bit. Have been doing a little bit of law school applications. But today I have the introduction of a very cool series with Aidan Etkin. So hi, Aidan. Good to have you here on the channel
Uh,
again.
Great to be here.
Do you want to introduce the series that we've been talking about?
Yeah, for sure. So I just got back from judging my first PF tournament at UKSO, and I knew that K-debate wasn't as developed, but it was, less developed than I originally thought. So I thought that, I should spread the love or the knowledge of K-debate from, how it looks like policy, LD, so PFers can better apply it. With that as my mission, I came to Mac, proposed a K-debate lecture series that dives into what Ks are, why they're strategic, and most importantly, how to answer them. So we won't be covering necessarily all of that super in depth today. We will just be starting, with some useful introductory concepts and, explaining arguments more. But should be really, really great. And if there's anything I'm missing, Mac, if you want to,
Yeah, yeah,
if there's
yeah.
any surprises I'm leaving out.
Sure. So as you said, this will be a multi-part series that we're planning. Probably, we'll have several different videos that span lots of different concepts and try to build you up from a very introductory level explanation. So you should be able to follow this even if you have very little familiarity with many technical concepts in PF or especially K-debate. And then we'll build up to some much more advanced concepts and try to test the limits of the logic for different ideas around K-debate, especially in public forum. And we'll be doing that kind of iteratively into the future, hoping to keep this going for a bit of a long time to try to really maximize the growth of K-debate, and not just like the growth of people reading Ks, but the maturity of K-debate in public forum so that whenever a K-debate does happen, it's the best possible and arguments are being made that engage with full nuance on both sides. So first, let's talk about, you were saying that you just got back from judging UKSO, specifically in public forum. I know that Ks have looked a little bit different in public forum. So could you give me an explanation for what you think the central problem you've seen is?
For sure. I think that, there's really two big issues, one of them on the debater side, one of them on the judge side. On the debater side, the people going for the K, I don't know if it's like intentional or not, but it's very obfuscatory, right? They throw around very specific terms that their opponents certainly don't know what they mean. I'm not really sure if the K teams know what they mean. But more importantly, it's very hard to engage given that. It's that even if, like, for instance, a K team is trying their best to be accessible. There's this fundamental gap in just like knowing what a K is on the other side or how it's different from a regular argument or, conceptually what it's trying to get at. And your opponent's not going to like give you a lecture in the middle of the round. And that's led to a lot of issues on the responding to K side. And the second big issue on the judge's end is in the face of all of this, it seems to be a growing trend, if not like a very common phenomena, that judges actually err in favor of the K team, who, in my opinion, is not doing that necessary explanatory work, which is a little bit weird because, debate 101 is that an argument must first be proven before the negative, or I guess the other
Right,
side
right.
in
It
this
seems
case is
like
burdened with rejoining it. So it's
judges
just
are kind
like,
of
yeah,
putting the cart before the horse here, like assuming that an argument is true before the other team even makes any responses to it. Or but
yeah,
rather assuming an argument is true before it's even given any proof, any like reasons behind it at
mhm,
all.
mhm. Yeah, so that's definitely something that we want to touch on. And hopefully, after this lecture or series or a couple of episodes, this aforementioned gap is closed a little bit, and K debates can be more engaging, pedagogically valuable for both sides, and judges will actually understand the arguments in front of them, such that if they actually believe them and are going to hack for the K anyway, at least they have reason to do so, right? At bare minimum. So really excited to go over all of this.
Yeah, absolutely. So the first thing that I think we should do is just run the clock back a little bit to the most basics of debate. This will be review-ish for a lot of people watching this video because we'll go through technical concepts, but we're going to do it in a bit of a different way than you might be used to. So this is kind of a retelling of how debate works that leads logically to K-debate. So the first question that I have for you, very basically, is just like, why do people do different things in debate and innovate different kinds of strategies?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, at the end of the day, I think the primary objective of any competitor or their coach is to produce an argument that wins, right? And specifically, in order to define what we mean by strategy writ large, we can just say it's an argument, that is read and deployed for a particular reason. And most importantly, I think that a strategic argument is an argument that's iterative and assumes a response to itself before even being made. For instance, a argument that would do that is something that has a built-in preempt to
Right,
an
right.
inevitable response that another team can say. And a typical example of this is you have like a nuclear war argument, and then you maybe read a card that's like, and this causes climate change, right? So
Yeah.
before your opponent has even read a climate change impact, you have already explained why your impact turns theirs or causes theirs to happen, which
Right.
is a strategy, as opposed to just making an argument, if that makes sense.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. So we're talking
And
about
yeah.
arguments. We're talking about them being strategic. Can you
Mhm.
first, like, let's dive into each of these ideas, which are deeply
Yeah,
interconnected. Let's take them one by one. So, what do you mean by an argument? What are like different types of arguments, for instance?
for sure. I mean, the loose definition of an argument is something that quote unquote disagrees with what the opponent has said, or something that, says a thing that can be disagreed with. But I think that's kind of true of a lot of things and not a very helpful definition. In terms of debate specifically, I think it's useful to understand an argument constitutively. So, and in terms of like what its elements are, right? And I think an argument, in order to be complete, has to satisfy a few criteria. It has to have uniqueness. It needs to have a link, an internal link, an impact, and sometimes, unless it's something like a disad, it has to have solvency for it, right? And
Sure.
I guess this is an argument in the sense that if it is lacking one of these things, it is not an argument insofar as it can, never be argued successfully. And we can kind of like prove that in a second through an example. But is that definition fine to use, or should we kind of take a step back or move it
Yeah,
forward?
I mean, I think it makes sense to me. It is worth noting
Mhm.
that this is like a sort of loose definition, and also
Yeah.
that this is not necessarily a true definition. This is like an example of one way you can simplify arguments that tends to be fitting for the arguments that we have in debate. And just to
Mhm.
define our terms a little bit, and maybe to take this step back in terms of structure, the reason that we know that these things are true, that we need these different elements, is because if you don't have them, like Aidan was saying, then your argument doesn't, it's not really workable. So for instance,
Mhm.
if the same thing you say is going to be caused by the resolution is already being caused by something that is not the resolution in its entirety, then like obviously you don't really have an argument. Even if it's true that this will happen with the resolution, if it happens equally so without the resolution, then it's not something that only happens with the resolution. It's not really an argument at all. We say that's not unique, right? So uniqueness is the first step. You need to prove that it only happens with the resolution and not equally so without it. Obviously, you also need to prove that it happens with the resolution, so that's just the link. Those two together create some sort of comparison between the world without the resolution and the world with it. Usually, the world without is the status quo. Then you have some other logic about how this departure creates some other consequences. And this is like our internal links and stuff, just extra steps like A leads to B leads to C. And then finally, you naturally have to have some reason this matters. Some sort of impact, usually like how this affects people, if we're talking about the standard consequentialist utilitarian logic that we use in public forum. And this part is actually really interesting because there's an assumption in here that is maybe even an extra element we haven't talked about, that it has to have some sort of impact to why it matters to the round. Like why this is something the judge should consider. If we take the earlier definition of an argument as just anything that can be argued against, then everything is an argument. I could just make statements. I could say like I really like cheese in the round, and like you could argue that I don't really like cheese, but it's not an argument that the judge should consider for my side unless I justify somehow why it has not just an impact on me liking cheese, maybe it increases my happiness, but why that's something that matters to the decision in the round. And usually happens through a connection to the topic, because intuitively, the natural idea is that we're here to debate yes or no, is the topic true or not. But as we'll see later, like this actually becomes something that we can pull open a little bit more and stretch with different logic about what should matter to the judge as an argument.
Yeah, for sure. I totally agree with all of that. And a lot of what we talk about here will certainly make a reappearance when we touch upon K debate a little bit more substantively. The other thing I want to do just to hammer in this concept is leave an exercise for the viewers. So just imagine a scenario. You are a judge. One side is pro, the other side is con, and we can use, PF as an example. And let's say the con is going for a disadvantage, right? And the con wins that the disad is unique, wins that there is a link to the disad, wins that, for instance, that there is an internal link between the actual scenario and some sort of impact, but loses with 100% certainty that the impact matters. In fact, by the end of the 2NR, you are 1,000% sure that if the plan were to happen and a disad were to occur, the world would look exactly the same. Who wins that debate? So on and so forth. What happens if the disad has a massive impact? It's like, the worst thing you've ever heard or seen, and the link is amazing, and an internal link is phenomenal, but it's inevitable, right? The disad is not unique. Whether or not the plan happens doesn't really have a bearing on this outcome. Which side do you vote for? And just apply that same logic to link and internal link, and you'll notice that an argument is not either uniqueness, link, internal link impact, solvency in parentheses. It must be all of those things strung together, else see previous example. And that's
Right,
kind of
right.
like the box that we want to tick when we're generating arguments for the K and when we're generating arguments against the K. So we know what we have to establish and we know all of the different points of attacks.
Right, right, right. And to be clear, we can categorize this a bit further. So for the PFers in the audience who might not understand like plan, distat, etc., I mean it that language is creeping into PF anyway. But this just means there's an argument on the con that is related to the topic about why the topic is bad, and you could pretend it doesn't have these different elements. But one thing that's useful in doing this, and this is something that's very familiar to most of the audience probably already, is that these arguments that we've been talking about are all kind of like they're arguments for voting for you. So they're like offense, like scoring a goal in a sport, for instance. Whereas if you take out each of these pieces, that's still an argument. You're still making an argument for why that piece is wrong. But that argument would be called, it wouldn't really have its own pieces, right? It's just denying a piece of theirs. And so it's more
Mhm.
defensive and it doesn't really have the same function. It's like your argument is uh, incorrect because it misses this piece. It is not unique. It does not have a link. It does not have an impact that should matter to the judge. And so therefore it is not a reason for the judge to vote for you. Now it's not necessarily a reason to vote for the other team if you make this
Mhm.
argument. And that's why it's defensive. Sometimes you can make a response that is offensive. So it's like it goes so much further that it's not just that this piece is missing, it's that it goes the opposite direction. So it's not just that your argument does not cause climate change, it's that this actively solves climate change or it actively reduces climate change. And so in that case, you're making a response, but it still has all of these elements. It would still have to be, we call this a turn, but it would still have to be unique in this sense, something that is different between the two sides of the resolution. And that's much more powerful than just nitpicking each part of their argument in a way that doesn't necessarily help you win. Each piece, like independently, would help other pieces that are offensive help you win. But on their own, this defense wouldn't help you win. So it's usually preferable to have as much offense as possible, to instead of reading just responses that are defense, to read turns that are offense, to say their argument is the opposite. And that gives you more chances, more opportunities to have a winning argument by the end.
Yeah, I mean, I totally agree. I think one of the most memorable lines that my coach told me when I was a debater, and something I, say probably too much to my own students, is a lot of people spend so much time trying not to lose that they forget they need to win, right? You don't
Right.
get to win for disproving your opponent's arguments. You also kind of need to prove your own. So conceptually speaking, building off of what Mac has said, there's really two ways to get the ballot. You can either prove that your argument ticks all of these boxes, right? So that it is sufficiently offensive enough to justify a neg ballot comparatively to their argument, which is missing one of these boxes. And this is just what we call, comparison, weighing, if you will. My impact is bigger. The risk of solvency is larger for me than you. Your link is weaker, blah, 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 blah. The other way The second way you can kind of, get the ballot, I'm assuming that's what everyone wants, otherwise you shouldn't really be watching debate videos, is to win on your opponent's argument, which is what a turn looks like. For instance, if someone reads a disadvantage and says the plan causes climate change to happen, you could say, sure, we'll admit it, the plan leads to climate change, but climate change is actually good, right?
Right.
Now your opponent's argument is a reason to vote for you. And so on and so forth. This is the logic of turns. So to reiterate, either win by establishing your own argument and, sufficiently mitigating theirs, or use their argument, concede the premise, contest the conclusion, i.e. turn, and make, like, they basically do all that offensive work for you, right?
Right.
They've established a uniqueness argument for you, the link, the internal link. You cannot concede an argument that you yourself have made. So now the sole question is yes, no, is the impact good or bad? Or if you want to look at it in the context of the link, you can concede, all of the other parts. We know that this impact is bad. We know that it's unique. We know that there's an internal link. The only question is, does the app create the scenario that causes it or prevent the scenario that causes it, right? And this is like a very useful strategic tool that we'll certainly delve upon later. But I think it's a good kind of frame through which to understand the goal of making arguments based on what arguments actually are. And this heuristic will not only help you in going for or against K arguments, but writ large, it should be how you approach policy, theory, and any other debate you have, right? If you have
Right.
offense and their offense is smaller than yours because of defense, it is impossible for you to lose the debate definitionally, unless your judge is, bad or on their phone. But purely technically speaking, offense, defense evaluation, it's kind of really simple what your goals are by the end of your 2NR or 2AR.
Right. Yeah, that makes a lot of sense. I mean, all debate is a game of comparison, and these are just tools to help you. The offense is what is being compared, and the defense is a tool to help you with that comparison and make that comparison easier. But at the end of the day, the way that you win is always going to be the same. It's having an argument that is better than the opponent's argument to vote for them. And that is just a game of comparison. So we've talked about making offensive arguments. We've talked about what defense is. There's a bit of an interesting thing I want to throw in here into our ingredients that we're mixing together into like some sort of incentive structure, which is these constraints in time. So, for instance, public forum and all of these debate events, but especially public forum, in the later speeches in the round, it gets really small. You get compressed into a 3-minute summary to distill like 16 minutes of content in the previous speeches, and then even smaller into a 2-minute final focus by the very end of the round. And so the question is like, it seems like in Final Focus, it's very difficult to explain any more than like one offensive argument. And so, why is there a strategic utility in reading things like turns or having more different offensive arguments in the beginning? And what is the strategy behind all of this?
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think the simple one-word answer is diversity. A mistake that a lot of debaters make is they kind of pigeonhole themselves into a singular strategy from the onset of the round, which is not only bad because it kind of allows your opponent to just spend more time on that one argument, which makes developing it even harder because you have to do so through quote unquote more ink. But also there's this opportunity cost of not only diverting your opponent's attention from that argument you want to go for, but also creating different arguments that you can go for based on the coverage like that your opponent really does of that, right? And a very simple example of this is if I don't have a turn to my 1NC, I only have something like a disad, right? Then this debate is like very, very narrow, which is kind of bad for me because they know that I have a very strict set of win conditions, right? And they can, dump on either the uniqueness of the disad, link, internal link, so on and so forth, after watching this lecture. And then I have to win, like we've just said, all of those parts or I lose. Alternatively, if we have something like a turn that is external, then I can, lose every part of the disad and still win. In fact, every single second they spent answering the disad is the second they didn't spend answering the turn, so it
Right.
becomes even more viable, right? Because the easiest argument to extend and the argument truest of them all is one not responded to. And linearly speaking, the less responses there are, assuming quality is equal, of course, the easier it is to go for an argument. So it's important not only to proliferate arguments in terms of quantity, quality being, a foregone conclusion, read good arguments, but also in terms of diversity as to what layers they target. Otherwise, your opponent will just be able to, say one thing to answer 5 other things, or, win one argument on, a disad and beat the entire thing. And
Right,
this is
right,
like
right.
either grouping or strategic like allocation of time or collapse, etc. So, you don't want your opponent to have an easy debate.
Exactly.
Obviously.
Yeah, so there's two things from that I want to distill that I think are incredibly important. One is this idea of having diverse arguments that are very different from each other. Obviously, you don't really capture diversity if you have multiple arguments, but one of their responses can respond to all of those multiple arguments. For example, if you're debating the current PF topic about the UK rejoining the EU, maybe you have an argument about how the EU has much better regulations on climate change, so the UK will take better regulations on climate change. And then you read another contention that's a different argument about how the EU has better regulations on something like, I don't know, water pollution. And then you have the same argument about how the UK is going to take these higher standards on water pollution. Well, these arguments seem very similar to each other. And yes, they're a little bit different, but they're very similar in the basic thesis of being how the UK will take a better regulation from the EU. You can imagine the other team might have a pretty easy job responding to that basic thesis in a way that applies to both of your arguments. And so that eliminates some of these benefits of diversity by making sure that they have to, trade off their time. Now it's no longer the case that 1 second spent on one argument is a second not spent on the other, because they can respond to both at the same time. And so real diversity, as much as is physically possible, involves separating your arguments out to make them very different and not rely on any of the same assumptions so that there's nothing they can do to make an argument that applies to multiple at once. And so we'll take that, obviously debaters will want to take this to the extreme as much as possible and really try to push their arguments in completely opposite directions, relying on completely opposite assumptions. The second thing that Aidan was talking about that I think is of crucial importance to understanding where we're going toward is this idea of layers, of like having arguments that are very easy to compare against others. Naturally, like you could do this on a micro scale with just different kinds of impacts. Maybe you say climate change is a more important impact in general than war because maybe climate change causes more wars and like more harms than many wars cause. And so, okay, that's all well and good. Then you could pretend that like whoever wins climate change is in a better position to win the debate than whoever wins war. And hopefully you're the one winning climate change. Hopefully you're also winning war. You want to have multiple options, but you think that you're more likely to win climate change and they're more likely to win war. So it's smart to go ahead and set up that comparison, which is the whole point of debate to begin with. But it might be like the obvious best form of this would be if we can come up with a layering scheme where we have an argument that is categorically more important than any of their arguments. Not just more important on slight comparisons, but that any kind of argument here in this layer in this of this type will be more important than even the best kind of argument of their other type. And hopefully the other type encompasses all of the arguments that they have. And so the
Mhm.
most extreme advantage, if we can find a way to make our arguments as different as possible and also have a categorically higher layer where it's like infinitely more important, then we'll be in the best position to win, period.
Yeah, for sure. And just to add on to that, I think the example that really sells this point is let's go back to the stuff about the disad 1 and C versus the disad plus turn 1 and C. So in the first case, the affirmative has to answer one of the four parts of the disad, and any one of these answers can become an independent win condition. In the second case, the affirmative has to answer all four parts of the disad and also beat the turn, else they lose. Let's say there's another turn that's distinct. Okay, they have to answer all those arguments, so on and so forth. But at the
Right.
end of the day, even if the affirmative massively mishandles the disad and doesn't do a great job on the turn, they still have their own win conditions. They can, for instance, maybe turn one of the disads, right? Now the impact of your disad is an advantage to the AF, and now the AF has two impacts against two turns. Wow, like yay. Or the affirmative could just be like, listen, even if you're 100% sure that the disad happens and the second turn happens, the third turn is wrong, and we get access to this impact, and it's the largest one of them all. Any risk of it outweighs, but the risk is at 100 because they haven't mitigated it. They still have a win condition. So in
Right.
order to truly get to that diversity, we don't want diversity at the level of substance only, but diversity across layers of arguments. Something that no matter what the 1AC says about the 1AC, there is nothing they can do to kind of cut off our ability to access/win this argument. And a
Right.
perfect example of this is something like theory. The stereotypical line that people say is extinction does not outweigh condo. And what they mean by that, condo being a policy theory argument, is that if you have won a procedural question, that what the affirmative did in this debate was proximately or immediately unfair, which undermines debate's nature as a competitive game, that should come before all hypothetical impacts about the 1AC, because
Right,
voting
right.
AF does not actually pass the plan, right? And, theory is a prior question to substance. And this is what it means to exist on a different layer. It means that there's no whining that the 2ER can do on how big the case impact is that can possibly save them from a theory shell. They have to take you up on that layer, answer theory with theory. And now this 1 and C, you can lose 5, 10, 15, 20 turns and, the same amount of disads and still win because you have that theory argument which exists on this, completely separate layer. At the end of the day, debate is not about making it easy to win only. It's also about making it as hard as possible to lose.
Right.
Your 2NR and strategy writ large should force the judge to just like think about how hard it is to vote against you.
Yeah.
And this is, something we can talk about later. The power of the phrase even if forces the judge to do the following calculus in RRT. If negative is right in this question, they win. But if they're wrong, they can still win on this. But if they're wrong, they can still win on this, so on and so forth. How many times do you think a judge could do that because before they're like, fuck, I'm just going to vote for them, right?
Right.
It's just so hard to vote against you, which makes it easy to vote for you. And diversity is, a necessary way to achieve that.
Yeah, yeah. And this is a good point about how diversity and layering are very interrelated. If you if the other team has better layering than you, aka if they have an argument that they can compare against all of your different options, then you don't really have a lot of different options, you know? Those options are kind of all the same in the face of this higher
Yeah,
layer
it's just an
issue.
illusion of choice, right?
Right,
Do
yeah.
I want to lose on theory outweighs case, or do I want to lose on theory outweighs the turn disad? I
Right.
guess the choice is yours. But at the end of the day, like the question you really need to ask yourself, and sorry to interrupt you, but I think this is just like a perfect point. It's like, okay, like close your eyes. The AF, debates like a negative strategy. The negative, let's just say the negative has a disad, right? And the negative is correct that the disad is, all four of the things that a disad needs to be. Can the affirmative win? The answer is yes. You can go for case outweighs, right? You can always go for this case outweighs Hail Mary. Let's say that the negative has a theory shell in the same scenario. If a viewer can email me or somehow submit a 2AR that beats a theory shell on case outweighs that actually makes sense and is a quote unquote argument, I will coach you for free for the rest of my life. I will, drop out of college and just like cut you cards all day. And the reason I make such a, insane proposition is because you can't do that. They're separate layers, which is exactly our point.
Right, right. You would have to find a way that the layer of your argument about the topic is more important than the layer of whether or not you were fair in the debate. And some people have arguments for this, but the prototypical example for why this is false is like, I don't know, if you came over and interrupted all of my speeches, or like you taped my partner's mouth shut during the debate. It wouldn't really make sense for the judge to just decide who won based on those conditions, based on the arguments that were presented in the round. If like half of my speeches are not given and the other half are like interrupted the whole time, so the judge can't even understand my arguments, then it doesn't really make sense for them to decide who won because it wasn't a fair debate to begin with. And there's actually like other questions that we would still need to justify specifically why theory is a higher layer beyond that. And the reason we would have to do that is because we'd still need to explain why the judge should vote for this. Like, for example, maybe there's a jurisdiction question where like someone else should handle this, and the judge's job is not to intervene as a referee. The judge's job is just to decide who won, even under unfair circumstances. And instead, there should be some other procedure for like overturning the decision or nullifying it based on procedures. But assuming that that question has been answered in a way that makes the judge have some sort of obligation to vote as a referee, then it becomes really difficult to show why the arguments about the topic are more important than the arguments about if those were made in a fair way. And so, to Aidan's point, yeah, this would be a very difficult task to accomplish.
Yeah, and I think that some of you might know where we're getting at, and others might ask yourselves why are Aiden and Mac talking about, debate 101 or strategy in a K lecture? And the answer is that this was all a large buildup to the point we were trying to make.
Reveal.
So, yeah, I mean, this is the eureka moment. If the first step of, a strategic argument is ticking 5 boxes, and then the next step is having diversity within a layer, and then the step after that is having diversity across layers or different layers, then it just makes sense that the more layers you have, the harder you make it for the judge to vote against you, and the more even ifs you can generate, the harder you make it for yourself to lose, the better your strategy is. So we've talked about reasons why the 1AC being a bad idea is sufficient to vote for you. And there's also an argument to be made that the 1AC being presented in an unfair or, theoretically bad way is a reason to vote for you. So what else can a 1AC do that should be a reason to vote for you? What can a 1AC do that isn't procedural or substantive that, might be something that the judge should cast a ballot against? And the answer is racism, which is obvious. Saying slurs is bad, and there's not going to be a debate if this happens. They'll probably automatically lose. But there's a more subtle element to it, which is what about racism that's implicit, right? Something like an assumption in the 1AC that isn't very great, or a representation in the 1AC that stereotypes a particular group of people or a country, or perhaps even some justification for doing the AF that is problematic in nature. For instance, a very prototypical K example is both, both people who are pro-Palestine and people who are anti-Semitic dislike Israel, right? And they would both advocate for policies that, do something like to Israel, but their reasons why, their justifications for advocating for that policy probably matter. So with all of that being said, if we can generate an argument such that the rhetoric of an AF is a reason that they should lose on top of the AF's procedure, on top of the AF's substance, then necessarily speaking, this would be strategic to do. And the point we're trying to make is that a K tries or succeeds, or maybe it doesn't, we'll kind of see, to, create that next third layer.
Right, right. So this increases our strategic possibilities to win by giving us a new path of offense. Not just that their assumptions are wrong, but that they're actively dangerous and there are reason to vote against them and for us. That this is a new, diverse piece of offense. It's unlikely that this argument about their assumptions and criticizing their representations will have anything to do with your other arguments about the topic. Probably they won't be able to answer both of these arguments or like a multitude of these arguments at once. They won't be able to group them together. And also, this functions at sort of a categorically different layer in a similar way that makes theory very strategic. Because it doesn't matter how small this might be, it seems like it's just a totally different kind of argument than the arguments they're making on the topic. It doesn't seem to really make as much logical sense to say, like, oh, well, it might be true that our assumptions were implicitly racist, but also extinction outweighs. Like that doesn't, we're talking about two different types of arguments that operate on different layers of the debate, and they don't really have that kind of interaction. So it's very difficult for them to say that their other arguments will be able to easily compare to this. So this seems to satisfy all of our criteria for a strategic element in debate. And also, it's not just extra ways for you to win, it's extra ways for them to lose. We've identified now like an extra part of their argument that they need to prove before it is a legitimate argument in the round. It's no longer just they need to prove it's unique and it has a link, etc. Now it also has to have, good non-problematic assumptions built into it. It has to rely on logic and representations that are plausible and that are not violent in nature or it's so wrong that they become dangerous, for instance. So it's an extra pitfall that their arguments might fall into.
Yeah, for sure. And just to clarify a little bit, so the relationship between theory and substance is not the same between theory and the K, because you can leverage theory as a reason that the K team should lose. Yes, our assumptions were bad, but your procedure was worse. The impact to our thing outweighs the impact to your thing, which is something we're going to talk about very soon. But the point is that the argument itself is still not groupable alongside other positions. Like every argument that answers theory does not necessarily answer a K, even though it's true that every argument that justifies a specific theoretical interpretation might also, not justify the K. In other words, there can be comparison between specific layers, but that does not necessarily mean that those layers aren't diverse the way that we have understood
Right.
diversity.
Right. As long as you have a layer that can be compared against the other ones and could be one of those highest layers that the judge could decide on, then it's diverse enough. If you're operating on a layer that is like doomed to be the lowest of the low and like will always be lower than everything else, then it's not a good sign if you're going up against these other layers. But ours, the K seems to have this effect where it can plausibly be compared. It might not win this comparison every time, but it can be very easily compared in a categorical sense against other arguments and other layers. And so this seems
Yeah,
great. Like we've explained, I think, how Ks have come about because of strategic incentives. It makes sense. If we were plotting the history of debate, we would kind of expect something like this to eventually arise because of these incentives. The one reason that we might not expect it to arise, though, is if it is unable to justify itself. So obviously, it can be like as strategic as possible if this argument is true. But first, there has to be a sense of like what makes this legitimate, right? We were talking earlier about how there's this extra box that kind of exists for all arguments, about how it doesn't just have to matter, it has to matter in the context of who the judge should vote for. It doesn't matter if I really like eating cheese, that has to be tied in some way to why I should win this debate. And so the problem that has been sort of repeated throughout history of debate, when people have these incentives to introduce the K, they have to first overcome this extra burden of proving to the judge and proving in the context of the round why it's something the judge should actually take seriously when they're deciding who to vote for, why it is a layer to begin with, why it is offense to begin with, and how it looks like what a kind of debate that would have this as legitimate offense looks like, and why that's a good model to have. So that is colloquially called sort of framework. This is like a general group of lots of different kinds of arguments about what debate should look like in a way that includes critical debate, and also why that kind of debate should be something the judge takes seriously when they're deciding who to vote for with their ballot. And so throughout the rest of this lecture and kind of all of our other lectures, we'll be talking about lots of different answers to that question, including some answers that say, it's not legitimate for the judge to consider, but a lot of answers that say it is legitimate in different forms. And so maybe, Aidan, you can talk to us a little bit about what framework should look like or different kinds of framework to answer this question.
for sure. I mean, this is obviously the part I was waiting for. I think I'll start just defining the really two different K framework strategies, and I'll end up focusing on one. So essentially, there's two arguments the negative can make. The first one is that it should be a sufficient negative win condition that representations, assumptions, or justifications that are problematic, racist, ableist, etc., are something that the 1AC should actively be punished for.
And really quickly, I want to like just have an aside here. You're using like negative and affirmative quite commonly, which makes
Oh,
sense.
sorry. Yeah.
Like I do think this is something we should talk about because I think a lot of PFers understand it in the same way, and maybe there are reasons for them understanding this way. But like they say, K's only make sense on the con in PF. I'm a little bit skeptical of that. So I want to ask what you mean. Like in the PF context, if the con is speaking first, for example, and the pro is speaking second, would it be more of like a second speaking K or more of a negative K?
Okay, I think the better way to explain it is it's an argument that applies to both sides that says the judge should evaluate competing performances. And if one such performance is, problematic because it's an ist or is, an ism, it should lose, right? Even
Okay.
if that
Right.
side fulfills their resolutional burden, the side constraint to voting for them is presenting ethical research down to, all of these things that we've talked about,
Right,
assumptions,
right,
justifications,
right.
representations.
Yeah, and this is
So I think,
intuitive. Yeah, because
yeah,
like I mean, in the same way that we were talking about earlier, like this I think stems very naturally from our logic that all arguments have assumptions, and so it naturally then makes sense that it doesn't matter what side you're on, you can criticize the assumptions of the other team. And so under this, it doesn't really seem to matter if you're first or second. I mean, maybe it's more likely you would do this if you're second because there's something already there for you to that has assumptions. But like, I don't see why the first team couldn't also do this in the rebuttal speech, for instance. And it definitely doesn't seem to matter very much if you're pro or con, especially in PF, where like we don't necessarily have the same assumptions that exist in other debate events, where it's like the affirmative has this burden of proof, where they really have to prove an argument for their side, and the negative is just trying to take that down. Whereas in PF, it's more like both sides are presenting a case that sort of runs in parallel, and so both of them have this burden to present assumptions and maybe critique the other side's assumptions.
Yeah, for sure. And I think the second argument, ironically, this one only makes
Wait, what
sense
was the
if you
first one
are,
again? I just
oh,
want
the
a
first
tiny
one,
recap. Yeah.
oh, yeah, for sure. It says even if the affirmatives, or sorry, even if the pro slash con meet their resolutional burden, a side constraint to proing or conning is their research being ethical. Or if
Right.
you want to
Right.
kind of frame it through the inverse, even if they prove that the resolution is true, if we have one that the assumptions they've made or the things they've justified or the things they've represented along the way were bad, they should still
Right.
lose.
Right. So kind of like
And
theory. Like
yes,
even if
exactly.
they've proven their arguments are all true, if they did it in an unfair way, they should still lose.
Exactly. And the second case, this one only really makes sense if you are the con going against the pro, says that links to representations don't necessarily have to be independent win conditions. So this is not the you link, you lose model, which is what the first point is called.
Right.
Instead, this argument is one about competition. It says if we are right that your ideological investments are either colonial, capitalist, etc., then you do not get a permutation against our advocacy. Or specifically, we can weigh the impacts of your assumptions against the case itself, even if those impacts are not directly causal. And a good example of this is something like the cap K, right? When the negative reads a card that says capitalism outweighs, they are obviously not making the argument that the one thing keeping capitalism afloat or that will prevent its collapse is Britain rejoining the EU.
Right.
If that is their argument, that is not a good argument.
Right. Right.
See before in the lecture when we talk about what makes an argument good. Instead, what they will say is, insofar as the affirmative has invested in capitalism epistemologically, or the affirmative espouses capitalist ideals, then we should be able to, weigh the terminal impact of that, every reason why capitalism as a system is bad, against the affirmative itself, right?
Right.
And
So
there are a few kind of issues with this. If it sounds
yeah,
crazy
like
that saying the word, yeah,
can I
yeah,
try to
sorry,
rephrase this first? Because I think
yeah,
honestly, I think this one kind of does make sense to me. It's like thinking about it as if we're policymakers, right? And like, if, for example, we were literally in Congress about to pass this, if we pass this bill that probably the passage of it is this affirmation of capitalist structures, probably reifies and like actually entrenches capitalist structures in doing this. There's kind of an opportunity cost to this, right? And so if we were thinking about this as policymakers and we had like ideal policymaking, where like if we agreed to this, then we could do whatever we want, you know? This would be an opportunity cost to doing something that tried to take down capitalism. If we're investing in capitalism, then we can't simultaneously take it down successfully if we keep investing in it.
I,
And this,
I would say that,
yeah,
I mean, I would say two things. I think first, that's definitely a false equivalent. I think the
okay,
better analogy is imagine you're a policymaker and you are about to sign a bill and your colleague says, wait, this bill espouses capitalist ideas. And you're like, okay, but, and you're like, okay, but like this bill would save the extinction of the human
right,
race.
right, right,
Everyone
right,
is going to die if we don't do this ASAP. And your colleague's like, wait, but listen, what the bill justifies or the logic that the bill sanitizes is one that
right.
also causes extinction. Okay, future shift. But the second
Sure,
argument is
sure.
that there's a difference between investing in something, in terms of like affirming it as a system and materially preventing efforts to dismantle that system, i.e., I can pass a policy that is, capitalist, which doesn't mean that every single group on earth who has been fighting against capitalism for decades will, suddenly give up, or people
Right,
who are considering joining the cause are like, okay, so here's all of this propaganda that is trying to brainwash me into being capitalist. There's this super materialist culture I am inculcated in. My work is something that I need to do to survive, and I don't own the means of my labor, which I don't think is very cool. And I'm on edge. I'm so close
right.
to joining this wonderful global communist party. oh, but Britain just rejoined the EU.
Right.
I'm out. Like that's just not what happens, right? And I think
Yeah.
holding the affirmative to any other burden is pretty unworkable. And
Right.
specifically, I think that the advantage of this type of framework argument, or the people who read it, the advantage they say it has, is it's more of this middle ground. I disagree. I think it's as, if not, more unfair than
Yeah.
the aforementioned first model. But externally, it's also harder to generate offense from, which is the boast of both worlds, right? You've
Yeah.
tried
Yeah.
to meet in the middle, and you've ended up nowhere at all because you're still just as bad. And you've lost all of your best arguments for why this is a good way that the judge ought to evaluate the debate, or a good way that, the affirmative and negative burden should be structured.
Right. And it does seem like quite artificial to me. Like, for example, one extreme could just be like, well, if we pass this policy, then like literally just consequentially it like encourages more capitalism. This obviously fails because it's not unique, and also
Yeah,
like how
exactly.
like realistically how much is the marginal link from this policy? Not at all.
Mhm.
But then if you try to like move back toward more of these what we call like reps links, which are these representations. Like it's not necessarily the policy, it's like the way you're justifying the policy. Well, one, especially in public forum where like we're not passing a policy, we are like talking about if the other government if the government passed this, if that would be good. It doesn't really matter if we're making capitalist arguments to justify this. Like the government is not using those arguments. It's just whether or not like they pass it, right? It's the most likely scenario that they pass it. But secondly, like it seems to be still the same problem. Like okay, who cares if it was a way I justified this or not? Like that justification exists out in the world already. And so the only way that you could possibly get away from this is if you artificially construct a new kind of illogical debate, it seems, where you get to leverage like all of the not capitalism and I'm stuck with all of the capitalism when I only have one policy that happens to be in capitalism.
Yeah, and I think it gets even worse when you kind of like stop and ask yourself, like, what is the bright line? So, representation. Oh shit, the 1AC said the word war. That is incongruent with an ideology of world peace. So now the world peace counterplan is competitive because they don't get a perm under my intern. Like, how does that ever hedge back against that? And what does the research burden look like on the negative when literally any metaphor or analogy that they can
Yeah.
draw between the app and something else is not only ground, but ground at the level of its own like extinction, like disad, right?
Yeah,
It's like,
yeah, yeah.
I mean, I guess I'm just like, spending 20 seconds a day on preparation because I go and I plug, an app into like ChatGPT and I'm like, okay, like what does this app remind you of? How does this app make you feel? Oh, it reminds you of capitalism? Disadd one. It reminds you of war? Disadd two. It reminds you of colonialism? Disadd three. Meanwhile, the actual effects of the plan being passed, the, quote unquote consequences of its implementation are just like the complete opposite of both of these things,
Right.
especially in the case of like, some like labor market policy. Well, actually, it kind of depends on like the AF proper. But I don't
Sure.
know. I think a good example is like a crypto regulation AF, right? Like the
Right.
Britain crypto AF. Like it just doesn't make sense that you would say something like government regulation of financial resources is capitalist when the entire premise of something like communism or socialism is central planning, for instance, right?
Yeah.
So it's the AF's core representation, the main idea, if you will, is certainly not capitalist. So where do we draw the line? Like, even though the
Right.
AF is 99% capitalist, you said the word money, so you're gonna have to defend all of capitalism. Like, it's just an untenable burden. And
Yeah.
it's
And
unfair, so on
right.
and so forth.
And it's like further complicated by the fact that there aren't counterplans or plans in PF. So like
Mhm,
who
mhm,
said
mhm.
you get to say we should like do this other thing that is against capitalism in the first place? And like it again, it doesn't really satisfy our strategic consideration of being a totally different layer because it's still they can compare their arguments against it. So it doesn't it's a bit puzzling in a lot of different ways.
Yeah. So, I mean, I have a lot more thoughts on that, but I kind of want to put that on the side,
Yeah.
like on the back burner for now,
I'm
and
good
kind of
with it.
focus on the first interpretation, right? So
Yeah.
just to reiterate, there are more problem, there are more problems in debate than bad plans, and the only recourse to addressing those problems is an interpretation or model of debate in which calling out racist or otherist, A, assumptions, R, representations, J, justifications, is something that the negative can win for, right? So this seems to make a few kind of assumptions. sorry, I don't want to use that word in this context.
Sure,
This
sure.
seems to imply a few things, right? Seems to imply that one, winning is key, that the negative ought to receive the ballot in the face of bad research. Two, that there is an impact to bad research, that there is, some connection or internal link, if you will. Oh, we've went full circle, between the reading of the 1EC, either in this round or over time, and the impact the negative claims their interpretation is able to solve for. And the third assumption this makes, which intuitively seems like something crazy to call an assumption, but can be debated, is that the impacts to a world in a world without this model, so in a world where apps aren't, held to their like research, outweighs the disadvantage of this model, which we'll explain as fairness, right? It's unfair to let the negative, um, win for doing something that is outside the scope of its resolutional burden. But more importantly, it is unfair specifically to punish an con or pro team for being unprepared to debate an unpredictable advocacy. And the simple allegory goes, if we go and agree to debate about ice cream and you show up and you say that, I should lose because I didn't talk about cars, or, you bring up some complete non sequitur, I would be like, yay, we had a deal. This topic was agreed and announced and agreed upon and announced in advance. What are you doing? This is unfair. Right. And now
Right.
your burden is to justify why the merits of discussing cars or calling out the lack of discussion thereof would necessarily be something that outweigh the dismerits or disadvantages of this unfair imposition on the other side, on your opponent.
Right, right. For example, I've seen like I'm sure people have seen meme rounds in public forum that happen sometimes. I remember seeing one that was about like the NBA or something. The whole round was about like basketball teams. But obviously this one is very difficult sell, right? You have to make this case that like it is like the judge should approach debate in a way that allows us to talk about that like allows them to vote for a proper discussion about basketball teams, and that the judge approaching debate in this way is better for debate or better in some real world sense than the judge approaching debate in a way that excludes the strategy from getting their ballot. And
Mhm.
intuitively in that case, like seems like if it's much more fair because we had an agreement to debate the topic, the merits of talking about basketball don't seem to be all that great. And so it's like ridiculous to make this argument that the talking about the NBA is what deserves the ballot more than talking about the topic.
Yeah. So,
So yeah, yeah, go for it.
oh no, were you about to say something?
I was just gonna rephrase some of these like
Mm,
I would call these burdens. I'm actually this is interesting. I'm taking a term from world schools and British parliamentary debate that I think
mm,
is pretty apt here. So they use this term of burden for arguments, for any kinds of arguments. It's basically what you were saying earlier. It's just something that is necessary for the argument to be true, right? Or to be
mm.
something the judge votes
Evaluated, yeah.
for. Yeah. So in this case, you're saying that we need to have something that does matter, A, that like matters in some reference. B, we have to prove that the reference in which it matters um, is something that should apply to the ballot, that the ballot should be concerned with. And then
Mm.
three, we have to prove that. Um, I guess I feel like three and two are kind of the same, right? Like that the reference and under which this matters is something that is connected to the ballot or should be connected to the ballot. Just means that like uh, a kind of debate where we can get the ballot for this is better than a kind of debate for which
That we
in which
can't.
we can't. Yeah,
If not necessary, right?
yeah,
Um, and I mean, this kind of goes back to what we were talking about earlier. I would just call this the solvency part of K framework.
yeah.
And we'll kind of go into detail for why, absent this, it's kind of not just hard but possible to justify K framework. But
Right.
I kind of want to do a general breakdown, right? And tie in what we were talking about earlier to how I think K framework should be structured. And once we have that as a reference point, we can talk about how to answer all these arguments.
Yeah, let's do it.
So instead of saying, A, J, and R, shorthand for, those things, I'm just going to say the word rhetoric, right? I think it's like a good term that encapsulates, the point that I was trying to make. So to kind of pull everything together, Negative's argument is that we need to hold debaters accountable for the rhetoric and the word choice that is present in their speeches. If debaters are not held accountable, so this is a link argument. Link is that like rhetoric matters. The internal link is that, rhetoric that is bad over time is internalized. We start to believe it, we start to act upon it, and that materializes as, everything wrong with that rhetoric itself. In other words, if we are, making a lot of racist kind of statements, even if they're not explicitly racist, if they're implicitly racist, and we just say them over and over and over for a year or two or four, and no one ever calls us out, then we'll, kind of view those things as normal, act in a way that reflects that, and that would make us racist people, which is bad, right? Then the impact is racism. Crazy we have to justify it, or maybe not. But racism is bad for a couple of reasons. It's, a material harm. It's a safety issue. It's, something that is literally felt by debaters where maybe fairness is intangible. The solvency argument here is that not only is calling them out for their rhetoric key, but also them being punished vis-a-vis the ballot is as well. Otherwise, the affirmative can just be like, okay, well, you can tell us how bad our rhetoric is. We'll promise we'll never do it again, but we should win because we've met the original resolutional burden that we think is the only predictable one. And then the last part, I think, would be uniqueness. But this is kind of weird here because I think it doesn't make sense, i.e., even if everyone else is racist or you're going to be racist in the past, or even if you promise and, you solemnly swear to be racist in the future, it still is probably good to punish and deter every single instance of racism as this kind of deontological thing. Being racist elsewhere, out there, in other rounds is not justified doing it in here. So I think it's less to say that the negative is not burdened with uniqueness, but attacking uniqueness from the policy perspective is not something you should really waste your time on, right? It's not a winning exchange, and you should focus on some of these other issues. So to clarify, link, rhetoric matters. Internal link, racist rhetoric creates racist people. Impact, racism is bad. Solvency, that is the ballot. Uniqueness, racism is always bad, even if it happens elsewhere or is somewhat inevitable for
Yeah. I'm
whatever reason the
like
app has.
I don't think this matters for a lot of the
Mm-hmm.
reasons you said, but there's a brief aside, which is that I'm maybe a bit confused on the characterization of uniqueness here. It seems like it's
Mm-hmm.
better to characterize uniqueness as uniqueness in terms of the solvency, rather than like this is more like the structure of an aff than it is the structure of a neg, right? It's like because we have like a plan, which is the ballot should be cast in this way,
Mm-hmm.
that solves this. And so really like the rhetorical harms you're talking about are like the harms, like the bad stuff that is happening now, and the link in PF terms, because we on the app we still say uniqueness link impact when really in the policy people would say harms solvency impact.
Yeah.
Um, but we would say that the like if the other team says it's non-unique, really they're saying that the solvency does not depend on the ballot, that the solvency will happen now without the ballot being cast. And so then the
Well,
problem that we've identified
I
will
feel
go
like
away.
the kind of inverse is true, right? Because I don't think the actual AF argument is that solvency happens even if you don't vote for us. More so that voting for us does not ensure solvency, or voting for them does not ensure solvency, if that makes sense. So like uniqueness in that context is tied to solvency, but I think the relationship is the inverse. So just to clarify, the argument is not that regardless of whether or not we win or lose, we will stop being racist. So voting negative is not key. It's more so that because of debate's competitive incentive structure,
Yeah.
regardless of whether or not they win or we lose, we will continue to read the research they've criticized for insert all of these reasons, right? And
Yeah. That's
the
I
name
mean,
this would just be double down. This is another way of
yeah,
just saying
yeah.
double down.
This is just linguistically interesting
Yeah,
to
yeah.
me because it just seems like that's not what uniqueness normally means.
That's why I said
Like
it's a little bit like weird in K framework debate.
yeah, yeah. Okay, that makes sense. So I guess we'll just sub it in the word uniqueness, even though it means something slightly different in this case.
Just to clarify, we're just going to collapse uniqueness and solvency into the same bucket when we talk about Ks, because for all intents and purposes, they're very similar.
Yeah, just words
So,
anyway, just heuristics.
yeah. All right. So that being said, we've explained why Ks beat our definition of an argument, which also entails that they are strategic. So now we kind of want to go into the content, finally. We know what Ks are, why they are. Now, what are they? The answer is pretty straightforward. And I'll just follow the same roadmap and kind of give examples of how the K would tick all of these boxes. Starting with the link argument, I think it's pretty self-explanatory. that if the only thing that teams were ever able to talk about, call out, critique even, were the hypothetical consequences of a proposed policy proposition, then everything that is not that would be swept under the rug, and never, brought to the limelight, challenged, and would never change, right? And a very simple way of understanding this is how can you stop doing something you don't even know that you're doing and you're not being told is bad in the first place? For instance, let's say that I, debated my entire life on a specific circuit. And within that circuit, it was, very, very normal to thank my judges, right, at the start and end of every single speech. And then I transitioned to the national circuit and I, thanked my judges because it's just a natural habit that I've acquired. No one told me to stop. I was never punished for it. Nobody even commented on it in the first place, right? And the same is true of the rhetoric we use and the research we do. If I'm never told to check my assumptions at the door or watch my language, I never will. And often that, produces some problematic, word choices that seep their way into 1ACs, right? So that is why not contesting rhetoric, not allowing for Ks, necessarily allows for, racism to at least latently be present in AF. The internal link argument is that if this is normalized, if we internalize the racist rhetoric that we use, then we become racist people. And the term of art for this in K debate is called subject formation. Now, there's a way to justify this logically and a way to do so empirically. The logical argument is kind of like this trust me, bro posturing that's like, hey, we're all in debate. We must care about it. We do it for a long time and we invest, countless hours. So it has to change our mind. And if you ask them why, they'll say because it does. And if you ask them why, they'll say because of its debate. It's a circle, it's tautological. I don't think this argument is incredibly persuasive, not only because of its, warranting or lack of thereof, but because there's also a much better way of going about this argument, the empirical one. Specifically, I think teams should read evidence from either neuroscientific sources or rhetorical studies that explain the validated effect from a perspective of science that rhetoric has on our brain. A good example of this is a card with the last name Ingram that, my students read from break in LD. People can see that as a reference. The card said that the language we use, changes parts of our brain. We become addicted to words the same way we become addicted to drugs. And that's how subject formation occurs. That's why, quote unquote, rhetoric changes our mind. Racist rhetoric makes us racist people. There's this other card that's quite good, which I think was read more recently, maybe in PF. It's a Dodson. The evidence is Dodson. It says that, the habitual repetition of certain ways of thought and certain rhetoric literally changes the synaptic mappings of our brain. It changes the way that our neurons go off, and the way that our memories form, right? And it, becomes very, very easy to access a particular schema of engaging or understanding things if, you constantly bring it into like consciousness over and over and over when you do debate and when you do research, so on and so forth, right? And this is just a straightforward, or I guess a shallow kind of explanation on why debate shapes subjectivity.
Right.
Going
There's
full circle.
one
Yeah, sorry, go
more.
ahead.
One more just like book I would recommend on this is the colonization of the mind, which is a book I believe by Chinua. No, it's by Ngugiwa Thiong'o. It's a excellent like exploration of the same stuff. It talks about how like lingua franca, which are like the like for instance like French and English and stuff that were passed on to colonies during the era of colonization, like those languages have changed the minds of the people that they colonized in ways that like restrict their imaginations. Like different languages have different words for stuff, and if you have different words for stuff, then you think about that stuff differently. Like everyone,
Mhm.
the internal monologue that you have is in your native language usually, and so if the language that you're most familiar with doesn't have words for a specific thing, for instance, then you're unable to think about that in a certain way. You're unable to imagine things outside of the language that you've been habituated into. And so, obviously, this is the same logic within a language as it is between languages. That the language that you use, the rhetoric that you use, the representations you portray, those do influence your capacity to imagine different things.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, I think that's actually a like very good argument. Um, and I mean, if it's not cut, someone should definitely do it. If not you or me.
Sure, sure.
But just to come full circle, you know, rhetoric, if not challenged, is internalized. Rhetoric, if internalized, shapes how we behave and defines us as people. Now, the impact. Why is racism bad? Well, there's a few reasons. The first one is just in terms of the scope of the impact. Fairness is this thing that, is quite esoteric. You can't touch it, you can't feel it. Do you really know it's there, right? Is it tangible? Like, is there a tangible change when, the judge unfairly punishes you or restores fairness on your behalf? Probably not. But racism is material, right? It's felt in debaters. This can either be subtly or, like physically, overwhelmingly in terms of exhaustion from having to fare with racists round by round, month by month, year by year. It could be like an instance of just psychic violence, being exposed to that racist rhetoric. But the point is, it's something that fairness isn't, right? It's material, it's tangible. And that's why it outweighs. The second argument you can make is something or an argument about accessibility. PFers call this a safety issue, that racism rhetorically becoming something that is normalized, but large debate as a community being populated with racist people crowds minority debaters out. And that is bad because there is no point to having a super fair game that no one can play. And there's also an argument to be made, and I think that this is personally my favorite impact out argument, that this crowding out of, minority debaters is actually the ultimate form of unfairness, given the way that policy teams or anti-K quote unquote teams define fairness. We'll touch upon this in a bit, but as a quick kind of explanation, the easiest way to understand fairness is an inequity in engagement. It is easier for one side to win to access the ballot to the other, and that is because either they have a trivially low kind of burden in order to win, or you have a super high burden in order to win, right? But all of this stems from engagement. So if unfairness happens when engagement is hard, what happens when engagement is impossible? Because you're not even in the same community, let alone rule, as the people making these arguments. You obviously cannot respond to them. It's not that responding is difficult, which seems to, tracking all the stuff we've just talked about, be most unfair. So again, link, internal link, impact. Obviously, this might sound persuasive to some, others might not be convinced. That is the point. The point is that the way you explain arguments and the way you characterize what you are saying and the narrative that you spin has a very, very, very strong effect on how those arguments are evaluated and whether or not they win or lose. If I was giving this lecture and I said, racism is sometimes bad because it changes our minds and that is worse than fairness because it is material, you'll be like, okay, bro. But obviously, embellishing all of these details and using these rhetorical devices, pun intended, and the word choice even that I'm picking when explaining the argument matters, right? Words matter. And we'll kind of go over to the framework side if we have time, or maybe in a future lecture, and you'll see that maybe it's not as one-sided as you may think currently. But TLDR, all of these arguments are something that I think are winnable. It's up to you to defend them in the face of pushback and adversity. But the last thing we haven't covered, and what I think is the hardest thing to prove, but also in PF specifically, the hardest thing to disprove, if that makes sense, is ballot solvency. And what I mean by that is, I think that if the policy team is making correct responses for why it is not necessary to vote you up or them down in order to solve your offense, or either that, doing one or the other won't solve your offense, I think it's like, pretty hard to defend against. The issue is from the perspective of a PF judge, especially given the timeframes of this activity, essentially what you are telling them is, listen, we were racist, but you can't do anything about it. You can't turn back time to before we were racist. You can't stop us being racist in the future because your ballot does not set a norm. We're going to keep doing it. So, the ballot doesn't solve their impacts, right? So if they can pin this characterization of ballot solvency onto you, you are probably in a very bad place. So I think that's probably the part of K debate that is hardest for the affirmative to sound persuasive on, and create the quote unquote narrative that I was just explaining is important both for the K team and for beating the K team. So that was a
Right.
doozy. Mac, the floor is
Yeah,
yours.
I just
Yeah.
want to briefly on that last part. I think this is my intuition as well, is that this is the hardest thing and one of the most necessary things for the team that is using a K to do, especially in public forum debate, where I think there are more judges who are skeptical of this, although we're seeing this worrying trend where judge skepticism might be disappearing a little bit. I think that judges being skeptical, um, maybe skeptical is the wrong word actually, but judges requiring a line of sufficiency for arguments is being muddled with judges being interventionist in like
Mhm.
a negative way. And so there's this big fear that I think judges have of seeming unintelligent or seeming interventionist or seeming less technical and therefore like less good as a judge. And so there's this weird reversal in the trend that we're seeing where judges are very willing, too willing to vote for things they don't understand or vote for things that do not have sufficient justifications. But still, I think again, like the ballot justification thing seems like a huge point of vulnerability. And I think one of the best ways to understand this is to understand it as another comparative. Like this is one of my favorite things to do in debate, especially with technical concepts that seem to fall at first glance outside of the realm of my normal intuitions, is to imagine them as a comparison between two worlds, just like a topical debate. This comparison is between the world of debate, where this is given the ballot as a default, right? Where this is a drop the debater issue in theory terms. This is very similar. We talked about this earlier. This is kind of like a theory argument. I know that you've talked about this as like almost like one of the most OP theory shells
Yeah, yeah.
because it functions very similarly. So there's a world in which we treat this as a drop the debater issue, and a world in which we treat this as like a drop the argument issue or a drop the evidence issue, maybe. And which of those two worlds would you rather be in, basically? Which
Mhm.
of those would have a better debate in terms of everything? And I think doing that comparison might make this more tangible in people's minds. I think there's lots of arguments to be made for why maybe the drop the argument one is better, or like it does a lot of these things sufficiently while avoiding a lot of the harms of the drop the debater one. And this comparison can help root you in the entire framework debate because you can structure all of your framework answers around this comparison. It's kind of like having a counter interpretation in theory, where the entire theory shell debate is sort of structured as a comparison between two competing models of how debate should work. This is kind of the same way.
Yeah, so I think that's an excellent point, and it's not just a very good heuristic for understanding and conceptualizing arguments, but also for answering them in the context of a real debate. So whenever debaters see a argument like a K or a disad, they're usually very narrow-minded, and they kind of only ask themselves one question: why is the AF good? Or maybe why is the AF not bad? Instead, you should, do this proof by contradiction that matches it. Imagine a world where the 1EC didn't happen, or the status quo. Why would that, be like a bad world? And this applies to arguments about logic. You don't necessarily have to defend your logic as always good. You could also prove that the inverse of your logic, something that is not your logic, could also be bad, right? And thinking this way makes it very easy to have a lot of different arguments, more arguments, but also find responses when a very like myopic way of thinking like wouldn't let you figure out.
Right. Yeah, exactly. I think that's a great point. The last thing that I wanted to say about this lecture and this lecture series more broadly
Mhm.
is we're telling you kind of like the state of play that Ks are in and the state of play that we think um, like a greater understanding of K debate would lend you. This is not necessarily like a prescription for you to follow per se. These
Mhm.
are like we're offering you arguments that we think um, are useful for getting you to start thinking about how Ks should actually work. But at the end of the day, like it's your job to do that thinking, Like this should be a platform, a launch pad for you to create your own opinions about how K debate works. I really think one of my biggest takes in debate these days is like, I think one of the worst things that's happened is that people have stopped trying to do new things, truly new things, and have started copying each other too much. Um, Even the things that are new are just built on copies. They're all built on a pile of stuff that is already there that is kind of unquestioned. I think that everyone should question things more, including the norms of how you are told things work. And that includes arguments in general, which also includes K arguments. And so you should like come to your own conclusions about all of this. We're trying to pose you questions, basically.
Yeah, for sure. And if you disagree with us, we'd love to know, and either respond in a video. You can email either of us, or just like touch upon your thoughts in some way or form. Because maybe we're wrong, and then we can give better advice to everyone. Or maybe you're wrong, and you'll realize why. Or maybe all of us are wrong, and then there's third perspective that beats both of us, but they're in the shadows, and we'll never find out. But that's the beauty of debate, right? It's not a solved game. There's no right answer. There's only the best answer at a current moment of time. And I, for one, have 180'd on so many opinions of mine. For instance, when I debated in high school, I never went for framework once. I thought the argument was stupid. Lo and behold, this is something I'm known for now. So I think that just being very flexible in your beliefs and critical when you're told things is super important, because at the end of the day, if you talk to a lot of different people, they're all going to tell you different things. And if you believe every single one, like there's just like this contradiction and your brain explodes. So don't, have too much faith in yourself as someone who's always right. Acknowledge that you can be wrong, but don't always think that everyone else is someone who's always right. Just,
Right, right.
think critically. And, your competitive track record will thank you.
Yeah.
And I think with that being said, this is probably a good cliffhanger. We've introduced a lot of like very useful concepts that we'll touch upon later in the lecture series. Not only when we go over the practical application of K arguments, why they're strategic and what that strategy is, and also, the same exact thing, but on the other side, answering them. But also, I think that, it's something to give viewers room for thought as this general baseline of like, why the K is an argument. And maybe they can think of their own responses or questions that they can compare and contrast to what we talk about in the next lecture. But
Yeah.
something that I will say that Mac and I have decided to do and we think is very fun is this video in the description will have you can think of it as a brain teaser or homework or problem set, which is essentially a scenario that touches upon something that we've talked about in this lecture writ large. The answer isn't immediately clear. It's something you kind of need to derive for yourself, but it's very useful to think about. And, we'd love for y'all to submit your thoughts and responses. We'd go over them in the future, do some commentary there, and, see everyone else in the next lecture, which I think will be a lot more of a sit down on framework specifically, go way more in depth onto these, 4.5 technically relevant parts of the K, and also finally talk about how to answer it, right? Because right
Yeah,
now
yeah.
it seems like, we're being particularly one-sided, but don't worry. And, Mac,
Absolutely.
if I'm missing anything.
Yeah, I don't think there's much. One thing that will say is noticeably absent from our lecture today is also a sort of K that is a bit different, which is colloquially usually called the KF, or like NPF, this
Mm,
first constructive K. It's not necessarily so different. There's a reason why they're both called Ks, but we will also talk about that and the different ways of engaging in that in future lectures as well as we have some like exciting things that we're planning on doing with trying to innovate and hone more of these different framework arguments for all sorts of Ks in the future. But yeah, if you wanna try to participate and test yourself a little bit, please do fill out that form that will be linked in the description. A little thought experiment for you, a little bit for your minds to play with, and we'll use that as a jumping off point for some future lectures as well to get you involved in the discussion more directly. So thank you so much for watching this first lecture. Thank you so much to you, Aidan, for giving up your
of
time.
course, thank you.
Very generous for you to be dispensing all of this knowledge to the PF community for free. So yeah, definitely respect it. And see you next time for, I guess, part two of the series.
Yeah,
See you,
see
everyone.
everyone.